Mercy, God, dear Lord, we are here to learn a little bit more about your teachings. We would like to ask you to protect us, bless us, and help the people that will come tonight to do the reading, the lecture, the passes. And we would like to ask you your permission to open all meetings. So be it.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight's reading will be from the book Our Daily Bread, chapter 115, The Gate. So Jesus said again, "Truly I say unto you, I am the gate for the sheep." John chapter 10, verse 7. It is not enough to embody the gentleness and the tenderness of a sheep in order to reach the divine kingdom. The sheep must recognize the gate of redemption with the necessary discernment, and they must watch their step and disregard the appeals of the inferior order that appear by the wayside. From this, we can conclude that, in order to be victorious, prudence must be combined with cautious regarding the directions to follow. The loss of a flock does not always result from an animal attack, but because the sheep have wandered carelessly beyond the natural barriers in search of their own pasture, deaf to the shepherd's voice, or blind to the protective gate. How many sheep are attacked unexpectedly by the dreadful wolf because they are fascinated by the neighboring green pastures and wander off their own path, breaking down fences in an answer to destructive impulses? This is what happens to people in the course of their lives. How many noble spirits have lost precious opportunities due to their own imprudence? Even though they possess admirable qualities, they sometimes become arbitrary and capricious. In the majority of cases, they are like victorious and useful sheep who are, after acquiring a number of ennobling traits, forget at the gate that they are supposed to reach and break the necessary beneficial discipline in order to hand themselves over to the devouring wolf. This passage, I think there's many ways we can talk, but to me, when I was reading, and especially tonight's topic, we're gonna be talking about he who exalt himself should be debased or devalued. In a lot of when I'm reflecting about this passage, I think a lot about what it is the meaning of ourselves being here and what are necessarily we are walking towards. And Jesus came into this earth, and not necessarily to teach us how to live in a material world, but in the Gospel according to Spiritism, in the chapter 6, there's a passage that talks, that Hendrick might talk a little bit about later, where there's a perception that we think that the human species is a miserable species to live by. And it's not necessarily true. And the reason why is that when Jesus came to earth, it's not necessarily to say that the human life or the human form only exists on this planet, but instead he came to teach us that we are beyond just the material being, living in a material world. We are spiritual beings, and that our lives we are supposed to live beyond this earth, and it's beyond the universe and many other planets and homes that we might have, but also beyond this life. So in one of the teachings that what Jesus is saying is that we are the sheep, and he is the gate, because he is the one that will protect us from going beyond what his teachings. Material beings living in a material world is very easy to wander off and think that we are beyond, what God or what Jesus taught us to be. And I think it's very easy to lose track of what necessarily the meaning of life, the meaning of who we should be, and what is the answer to a better prosperous life and a better happy life, which is beyond what our materials can provide us. And what Jesus and Emmanuel here is saying is that, those who wander off, they are just basically getting eaten by the wandering wolf, because it is very easy to be impulsed by, cars and money and houses and everything else, and that is not what that doesn't grow our spirituality. And that's what necessarily grows our misery, because we put so much emphasis in these material goods, because we think that happiness belongs in these things, but they don't. And then that's why there's this perception that the human species is a miserable one. Because I think what I want to actually conclude is that what I'm saying is that Jesus didn't came to teach us to live in this material world. He came to teach us in a world of spirituality, of being spiritual beings and growing our spiritual selves. So what we need to do is continue to look at ourselves and make sure we watch out, so that as we are sheeps, and Jesus is our shepherd, and we must watch out for ourselves to not let ourselves wander, because it's very easy. Because sometimes we have things in our lives that we don't know that we've suffered through, because we just don't understand. We have a lot to do to understand ourselves and to understand what we feel and what we go through. So I think I've went over many ways, but basically what I want to say is that humanity, what I love about the passage is humanity is beyond ourselves, our material selves, our bodies, is beyond just the existence of every material goods that surrounds us. Humanity is our spiritual selves that goes beyond this life and this, within this universe. And I think that we have to really look out for ourselves, make sure that we are on the path, that we are following the sheeps and within the gate, because it's very easy to lose ourselves, and living in a world where we are lost, that's misery. So I think, and with the teachings that Jesus came to show us, that is the path of happiness and peace within ourselves and our spirit. So thank you, everybody. So now I am passing now to Hendrick, who will say the main talk for tonight. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Juliana. It's very good. Happy to be here again. Happy to see everyone, and happy to have the opportunity to have to study a little bit of Jesus' message in order to hope to be able to bring a little bit of it for everyone here. As Juliana said, we're studying today the Gospel according to Spiritism. It's the message titled, "He who exalts himself shall be debased." It's on chapter 7. Chapter 7 is the first, I think is the first of the chapters that starts listing the Beatitudes, what Jesus said in his Sermon of the Mount, and this is the one that says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." And this message today is is organized by Kardec and the spirits who put together the book, with 3 passages of Jesus that Jesus talked about being small and being great, and what is the vision for what does it mean to be great in the spiritual world, or in the kingdom of heaven. And so I thought I'd bring the Bible so we could read the 3 different passages. They're kind of short, so I think it's better to just read a few. Read a small part of it as we attempt to discuss it. So the first one is chapter 18 of Matthew, on verses 1 through 5, where he says, where the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" As he was, being asked by the disciples, and he said he basically invited a child, and had that child, a boy, I guess, stand among the man and said, "I tell you the truth, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So, Jesus is talking, or kind of telling his message. There's a bunch of parables. There's parables. There's a prediction of his death and so on happening in this chapter in Matthew. And in the middle of all that, the disciples, they want to, they come to him and say, "Well, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Right? We human beings have had an inclination to want to know who's the greatest from a very long time ago, right? 2,000 years ago, they were asking this, and I guess it's in our instincts to try to be the greatest at something, right? This morning, I think, maybe this morning was or yesterday, I was watching the news, and there was a really small bit of news that just made me think about how ridiculous we are becoming as human beings. There was a bit of news that said the Guinness World Records for the largest number of couples kissing at the same time under a mistletoe. It's Christmas time. Kiss under a mistletoe is romantic and so on. So a bunch of people gathered together to do a little event to show that they're like, "Oh, this was the biggest event of this kind." And it's like, how I mean, it's interesting, and it's a very silly example, but it shows how we are by nature always looking at this, at what's the greatest, what's the record, who's biggest, who's better. And so, Jesus takes the example, sees a child right there, takes the example, sees all these grown men, takes the boy who's not only a child, therefore naive, and I guess in the representation here, and he had already mentioned it chapter or 2 earlier, devoid of sin, right? So a child, so without sin, and and uses that image to show to those grown men who were all, followers of him, right? They were the original 12, the big gang, right, of Jesus. And they're all trying to figure out who's going to be greatest. And he uses that little boy and says, he who will be small will be the greatest, right? He who is like this child will be greatest. So introducing, or I guess, not really putting forward the idea of humility as one of the most important virtues of one's path to growth and to, as he puts it in the Bible, the kingdom of heaven, as we understand it, our progression, our evolving as spirits and growing towards, towards God, towards being greater spiritual beings. And I was reading some, in doing some research about humility in general. I grabbed this text from Raul Teixeira, where he says, humility is the flag bearer. It's the flagship of all virtues, right? It's funny that he used that term. I was, as I read it, or as I heard it first, but as I read it, I was thinking, humility is always thought as this virtue that puts us down, right? That makes me be down, makes me be below everybody else. And so his first description of humility is it's the flagship. It's the in a parade, right? It's the first float that's seen, or in a Navy brigade is the most important. It's the ship that's carrying the flag, right? So, and we think humility is as what hides us, or what makes us when you say be humble, is really put yourself down. And he's using this image of flagship of progress. So it was a very powerful image to think about, because if our objective is to grow, to progress our spiritual lives, as Juliana was just talking about, we need to work on our virtues. We need to work on on getting rid of our shortcomings, and work on growing our qualities and collecting virtues. And how Teixeira mentions humility as this sort of this flag bearer, flagship sort of virtue. And why does he do that? Sometimes we're very our idea of humility, just like we get confused with our ideas of what it means to love and charity, as he mentions here, but obviously he's talking mostly of humility. We tend to misunderstand the meaning of the word, and because of that, and we kind of we sometimes take shortcuts, mental shortcuts, or personal shortcuts to appear to ourselves and to others around us to have such virtues. So, sometimes, as he said, he puts it, sometimes humility is seen as being a coward. You're not brave enough to do something, or to be something, or to be what you want to be, or to go to help someone, and therefore you cower yourself, you put yourself down, and you don't do that. And sometimes it's people mistake shyness for being humble. Well, that person just doesn't want to show off, so they're kind of on the side and not really applying calling out attention, when sometimes that's exactly their way of calling out attention, is of being shy, being quiet, and hoping that somebody will come and notice them, and therefore kind of take them out of where they are, but trying to show themselves as humble, while really just hiding from others, and being proud in their own different ways. And so maybe I'll go back to the two passages. So the other two passages, since I haven't, I said we would read a little bit of it. In the second passage, it's again another couple chapters later in Matthew. He's talking. It says again, right after Jesus predicts his death one more time, a mother comes to request something of Jesus. She is the mother of 2 of his 12 disciples, and she's they don't. It doesn't say her name, but it says she's the mother of Zebedee's children, 2 of them who were his disciples, and she kneels in front of Jesus and says, says, I have a favor to ask. And Jesus says, what is it that you want? She said, grant me that one of these 2 sons of mine may sit at your right, in the kingdom of heaven, and the other sit at your left in your kingdom. And Jesus looks at her and says, you don't know what you're asking. And, it says, can you drink from the cup that I will drink? And both of them say, yes, we will drink from the cup that you will drink. We can. And Jesus says, okay, well, you will indeed drink from my cup, right? Remember, this is in his own prediction of his death, right? This is not too far removed from, his final days on earth. And he says, okay, well, you will go through this. You will drink from the cup that I drink. However, it's not my place to decide who goes in those seats. He says, it's not for me to grant. These places belong to those whom they have been prepared by my Father. And then when the other 10, right? So these were 2 disciples. When the other 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the 2 brothers. Of course, they were upset. Who are you to want to be the greatest and sit right next to Jesus up there? When he goes there, there's only 2 spots. Why is it that it's you, right? Again, our human nature wanting to be that special, wanting to be great, wanting to be, thought of as important. And Jesus called them all together and said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your slave. That's one of the translations, and the other translation says minister, and the other just says servant. And whoever wants to be first must be so whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Again, servant and slave and minister used in different ways in translations. And then he completes that, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So again, talking about his own life and death, but bringing again the idea that in the kingdom of heaven, where we're going, where you're aiming to go, where we're following my message, following God's way, you're going towards a kingdom that's not like this one, that of the princes of the Gentiles, right? That lords over the Gentiles. It's a different kind of kingdom. And if you're going to get there and be important, you must first serve those who you think are not so important. Those who are below you here, go be their slaves, their servants, right? And so again, Jesus talking to us about how it's our ideas of this world, our ideas of what's great and what's important, are very misguided towards what's important in the kingdom of heaven, the spiritual life, as Juliana pointed out. And so the last piece is in Luke chapter 14, and at this time, Jesus is in the house of a Pharisee, right? and he was being carefully watched. This was one of those occasions where, he's there, important people around him. Of course, everybody is watching him, making sure that, they catch him doing something wrong. And this is a Sabbath, right? It's a day where you're not supposed to work, not supposed to do anything. And so he actually, this isn't in the Gospel according to Spiritism, but I thought it was, it's interesting to say. So right before this part here that I'm going to read, he's actually testing, the Pharisees think they're testing Jesus, and he kind of starts testing them out. Say, well, this man needs to be healed. Can I heal him now? Can I send him, or should I just send him out and heal him later? And nobody says anything, so he says, okay, you will be healed, and let's see, what did he have? Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? He healed the man and sent him away. And of course, that meant that he did a little work, which is controversial for the Pharisees. And he said, well, if it was your son that fell in a well, would you let him be there overnight and pick him up the next day? Because that's the same kind of saving that I'm doing here. So he's already provoking them with that thinking, and they're not, they thought they were going to be provoking him, of course, and he's making them think. Would you not immediately pull your child out? And of course they had nothing to say. And as he noticed the guests in this house arriving, and this is the message that is relevant to us here, he says he starts telling a parable. He says, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor. Do not go sit in the front row. It's like you guys are all following that today. Everybody in the I'm glad that I'm here to learn just for myself, and I'm just speaking. No, but I'm learning from you all. Says for a person, so do not take the place of honor, right? The front row seats. For a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this man your seat. And by that time, all the seats will be filled, so you're going in the back of the class, right? Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. When you are invited, take the lowest place so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. So it says humbled here, and the other translation says debased, or devalued, right? And so, we're looking again, just to recap, the blessed are the poor in spirit chapter, and we really, Jesus in many ways has been telling us, lower yourself, put yourself in the least important place, so I guess the question is, are we interpreting that? How are we interpreting that? What does it mean to be, put yourself in those places, right? Because, again, whether we're trying to fool ourselves, whether we're trying to fool others, whether we're just trying to be lazy, our view of the different virtues that we should be collecting is sometimes skewed. And so, as we were saying here, it's not a virtue of being shy. Being shy has nothing to do with being humble, with humility. As Hao Teixeira points out, he says, instead of it being shy or shyness, really humility is more of an active virtue that a proactive virtue. And what do we mean? And what does he mean by that? And how should we think? Should we think about it? And says he points out that person who's humble, the humble man or woman person, is one that simply does what they know they have to do, right? Whether it's at work, whether it's in the in spiritual matters, whether it's in life matters. How often do we have we been in a situation where, well, you go and you do something, I don't know, you cook a cake, you bake a cake, right, or cook something good, and somebody goes and says, oh, this is really good, and the person will go, oh, well, not really, I made a mistake here, and goes into all of this like long story of how what they did was really not very good. You're just being kind. That's a lot of work to try to show that you're humble. Right? A lot of work. And that's what he's pointing out, is sometimes we just put a lot of effort into showing that we're humble instead of just being humble, right? And what's the appropriate answer? I mean, if it wasn't you, say, oh no, my mom cooked it. I brought this turkey. Okay, great, it's delicious. My mom cooked it. Okay, she cooked it, not yours. But if you did, oh yeah, I did, thank you. That's it, right? It's not, oh, I could have done better. Sometimes we do that. Are we really doing it to, or I guess, what is the reasoning behind doing that? Is it not just our pride instead of our humility pushing us towards that? So, that's just one example of our misguided humility. So he says, the humble creature, the humble person, is not the one waiting. So not just not looking for praise and then, showing themselves off as worse than the praise to make themselves look better because of it. But it's also somebody who's, humility shows itself in people who don't wait for things to fall from the sky, to come to them. They just go and do it. Now, they're not showing off that they're doing it. Whatever it is, again, I like to use examples that are easy to think in our material lives, of course, but mostly because it's hard to come up with solid examples that are very enlightened for all of us. At least, I find it hard myself. But looking at simple examples from life, from our daily lives, we can hopefully find those situations in our lives and say, okay, this is how humility is applied, and I really haven't thought about that in the past. So, one of the things. So he says here, these are not people that are sitting quiet necessarily, just waiting. Like I said before, waiting for somebody to come and find them and say, oh, you're so humble, you're just sitting back there and not saying anything. Maybe you've been thinking a lot, maybe you have a lot to say. Sometimes maybe not. Maybe all they're doing is kind of making themselves look better than they are, right? How many times have we been in that situation? So, hiding ourselves, or, essentially as the word is strong, but he uses the word cowardice. It's a very strong word, but sometimes, is that not what we're doing when we're trying to hide from our failures and and kind of try to show that we're not as good as we could possibly be. So the example of the child, for example, right? You know, a child is not expected to know anything. A child is not expected to be good at anything. However, we seem to think sometimes that children are better than adults for some things, right? Well, they're just better. They just think better than we do. You know, is that true? Or is it because I, as an adult, recognize that there's a lot of problems in the way I think, and I wish I could just get away being wrong like a child can? Usually a child mostly can get away with being wrong. So coming to, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I'm going to get to that, to what that means. You know, Kardec comes and, you know, in developing this section of the chapter here, he's mentioning humility, or where he's talking about humility. He talks about it as this essential condition of the happiness, for the happiness that Jesus has promised to those who are chosen by the Lord, or who are chosen to for the kingdom of heaven. And he presents the that you know, in concert with the blessed are the poor spirits, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And he takes the child as an example, right? So he says, he who is humble is as a little child. And really what that means to say is no pretension of superiority or infallibility. Now, children, and those who have children or have had children that have grown into adult, know that there's a point in a child's life where even if he's thinking or she's thinking that she's better than a friend from school, they don't think they're better than their parents or than adults, right? There's a point in time when they turn teenagers, and then now they think they're good, better than anybody, right? But as a child, they actually don't have that feeling of being superior to adults or to God, like, you know, sometimes we think we are as adults, you know, not considering, you know, God as part of, you know, as the creator that he is. And, you know, children also don't have a sense of infallibility. Like, at some point, you know, that they can fail. They fail. They fail a lot. They fail, as you know, in stepping up and walking. They fail in talking. They fail in riding the bikes for the first few times. They fail all the time. And you know what? Most kids don't care. They realize that they make a mistake, they get up, they try it again until they get it. They don't have this sense that they need to be infallible, that they need to not fail. We grow up and we kind of lose that sense. And I was talking to somebody recently about that in terms of language. You know, most people would say, well, children learn language faster than adults. Would you say that's true? You think so? Really? Children learn languages faster than adults. You think so? Well, I don't know, but I could give this text to my son right now, and he could try to read it, and he would know nothing that's here, right? It doesn't matter if it's English. If I translate it into another language that he might be speaking, he wouldn't know still, right? So as an adult, I understand this text. Most of you guys understand this text, right? If you know to read English, you will understand the text. It takes a lot more than just the words to understand it, because we've actually, you know, over time, we've learned a lot. Now, in learning a new language, when it gets to a point where we say, oh, let me try to learn a new language, every time I make a mistake, I'm thinking about that mistake more than I'm thinking about, oh, what do I learn next? Or, okay, how do I apply this? And I find, oh, that's so hard to memorize. Oh, that word I can't remember. or I don't know this expression, and so we get frustrated, right? Because we think we should know. We think this should be easy. We think I should just pick this up, and I can't. Now I can't because at some point I'm choosing not to, because, again, excuse me, goes back to this sense that I don't like making mistakes, and I think that that's hard. Now, learning a language perfectly, that's a different story. Now, a child that started on a language as a child and then over time studies in that language and grows up so that they can read, texts like these, then of course they will have become better than us. But how many years of their lives did it take to get to that point, right? So I am now a grown adult, know one language or two, and now I want to learn my second one or my third one. I want to learn it in a month. I want to buy the CD that says, I'll be speaking in 60 days. It's not going to happen. However, by the end of 60 days, even if you started, okay, let me start on this language with a child who's 4. Why would a child who's 4 or 5 learn it faster than me? Because if they want to, they'll have the time to do it. They'll just do it. Now, if you do it with the same amount of dedication and thinking that they do, you will learn all of the expressions that you need within those 60 days. And you would actually be able to have an adult conversation, even if for just 1 or 2 topics. A child would still just know a few words and kind of get around, and they would hear more. So maybe your years are harder to have a little more trouble than learning new sounds than a child's does. But that's because they don't really care. They're just associating new stuff. And we eventually give up on associating new stuff because it's too hard, right? So I don't mean to say that children aren't faster. They probably, yes. I learned Portuguese a lot more easily than I did English and Japanese and French. I tried French. And yes, it's hard. But if you put the time, right, like a lot of adults have done in their lives, right? How many adults know more than one language that they learned after they were adults? It's possible, right? But we can't expect that, a child that's immersed and essentially they're making all of those connections, and that's all new learning for them, and they're excited about that. That it's going to be easier for them. It's just they're interested in it. Right. So, again, as an example of being humble, as an adult, we're thinking, children are so much better at this. And maybe are we just being a coward, like what I pointed out before? Am I just being lazy or shy? I mean, how much of not learning a language is it because you're shy, because you don't know how to sound, because you're going to sound funny, right? How many times do we not speak a different language because I don't want to sound funny in front of people who are smart, right? And so, is that humility, or is that our pride saying, let me try to be humble here, and act like I'm not so good, right? So again, making us think a little bit, and I'm using a very simple case, which I think everybody here should be able to relate to, because. And I don't mean this to demean anybody. It's really hard to learn another language. I'm trying, right? But I also, and this dawned on me recently. It was just watching a random video on YouTube from a guy who tries to sort of sell his services as teacher of a language. He said, adults learn it much faster, and it's true. Now, you do if that's what you want to do, right? If you have the time, if you're thinking about it, because you already have all of those connections of what the concepts that you'd be talking about. A child will be talking about things that they want to play, right? So it will cover everything that they want. And it won't cover anything that they don't understand or they don't care about, right? So just like, with adults. Now, obviously, we're all busy. It's very hard to find the time to do it. So it's not, I don't mean to put anybody down, but if we use this in the context of thinking about how we are humble or not, or we're not being humble in our spiritual life, it's a good, it's something good to think about. And this is why I brought the text from Hao Teixeira, because he says, he uses the expression, humility is the path of which on which love moves. Again, it's sometimes we misunderstand charity, sometimes we misunderstand love, and we'll have a lot of opportunities to discuss those virtues as well. But if we understand humility as the path in which love, the ultimate goal, moves, we can see how that is. It's not, oh, you cooked this, it was delicious, saying, oh, thank you, versus trying to be false, pretentious, or false humility. And we can see, and it's interesting the way he lays it all out. He says we can see humbleness in everything in nature. He says, for example, the water that eventually comes to to our table. Excuse me. It says, we don't see the struggles of the water that comes to us, but it evaporates, it rains, it goes down, and it goes through rocks, and the rock is filtering it, right? And and if we were to think as water as something that can feel, it would be feeling the pain of being sucked into the bottom of the earth, and eventually coming out clean, right? And he says, if we look at the simple example of water, it's there. We don't know its struggles, right? But think about everything that it goes through without complaining, without really, without stopping its function because nobody's paying attention to it. These are the images that we need to think of as we are attempting to become better servants of the message of Christ, right? So the idea, he who humbles himself shall be exalted, and he who exalts himself shall be debased, is not about doing that just on the outside. It's doing that on the inside. It's saying, I came here, or I came here and cleaned this hall. I don't care if anybody noticed or not. I came, did my job quietly, came and left. Whether that's in the Spiritus Center, whether that's at work, it's knowing what you ought to do, doing it well, and moving on without the idea that you need to be recognized, that you need to be praised, right? He said, as Kardec points out here, Spiritism confirms this theory of that Jesus has put forth for us, in the experiences that they had in the different, talking with the different spirits that were giving the messages and helping write the books, and the spirits that were in the different sessions of mediumship sessions. Says most of the spirits who are of higher grade or pedigree, I forget what word he has here, are usually people who were nobodies on earth, or went through a lot of struggle and weren't being noticed. And on the other hand, those who were full of riches, titles, and glory, were nobles by birth. If that's all they had, and they brought that, and that's all they thought they could bring with them, essentially all they brought with them was their prides. I mean, Spiritism comes to, and puts to light, into a different light, or a better light, I guess, the notion that what we bring to the afterlife, what we bring to the spiritual world with us, is really just our virtues and our vices, or our quality and our qualities and our shortcomings. And if you don't have much to show in terms of virtues, because you really didn't do anything for others, for growing those around you, then, but you had a lot to show in riches and titles, then really what you developed was your pride, and that's what you bring with you as a spirit to the afterlife. And so what do we take from, what do we want to take with us as we continue to progress in our lives, right? And our spiritual lives, as we go towards the kingdom of heaven, right, or the spiritual life. Are we taking with us the position that we, that as Jesus pointed in his parable, the idea that we were putting ourselves out front and showing ourselves as most important out here, or were we, silently doing our work and serving those that needed serving, and how well were we doing that? That's really what's going to count as we continue to, as we transition from this life to the next, and so on. And so to finish here, he says, Spiritism also shows another side of this principle within the process of successive reincarnations, when those who in one life raise themselves to high positions are then born in another life in a lower position, in lowly conditions, if they have allowed themselves to be dominated by pride and ambition. And so, Kardec finishes this section in the chapter in a very interesting way. So I thought I just finished with that. He says, therefore, do not seek the highest positions on earth, nor place yourself above others, if you do not wish to be obliged to descend. Just like in the parable that he said of, if you're coming into a wedding, don't go into the VIP section, right, in the honor area. Wait to be called. Let your work do the speaking for you. And he says, seek the most humble and modest positions, seeing that God will then give you a more elevated place in heaven, in the spiritual world. But then he ends, if you deserve it. So I thought I'd mark that down, because ultimately that's the message, right? Is what are we doing to deserve being in that place? Are we being two of the disciples that invited the mom to say, oh, can you, he has a mom he loves, maybe you're our mom, and maybe he might like that you're asking, or maybe she really wanted them to go and be left and right of him. Are we being like those two? Are we being like the mom? Are we being like the other 10 who were starting to get all upset? Why do you think you're so important? Or are we doing something to deserve our good place in the spiritual life, or as it's put in the Bible, the kingdom of heaven? So there you are. I think I hope we all do our little small bits and pieces of work in this earth to be one or a few of those that as Kardec says here, God will then give us a more elevated place. Sorry, I'm mumbling now, but God will give us a more elevated place. Am I going to be one of those that deserves it? So, a lot to think about. Hopefully, this has been helpful to you as it has been helpful to me. God bless us all, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Now we're going to do the passes, and right after that we will do our final prayer so we can finish our meeting.